When Jesus told St. Peter he had to forgive 70 times, 7 times, one of the apostles probably said, great, not only do we have to forgive, but we have to do math. Today we have the parable of what's called the parable of the unmerciful servant. And it was occasioned when St. Peter approached Jesus and asked how often must he forgive his brother. I wonder if he was talking about St. Andrew, or perhaps he was talking about one of his spiritual brothers, one of the disciples, like Matthew or one of the others. And he said, how often must I forgive him? As many as 7 times. Peter was being very generous, very magnanimous, very merciful, because forgiving somebody 7 times, that's quite a bit, especially when the Talmud and other ancient writings, the rabbis recommended forgiving another person at least 3 times. But St. Peter wants to forgive 7 times. What is the Lord's answer? He said not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. Some translations say 77 times. It could be interpreted either way. But I think most scholars say 70 times 7 refers to the Jubilee. Every 490 years, there was this great Jubilee, of course, and it represented a time of forgiveness whenever the Jubilee would occur. And so this was a major Jubilee. And so Jesus, to teach how we need to forgive, gives us this parable of the king who calls in a debtor, and this debtor owes him, it says, a huge amount. If you go to the original language, it says 10,000 talents, and that helps us understand just how much this debtor owed the king. Remember, a talent was a measurement of weight in silver or gold. So it was normally 1 talent was 6,000 denarii, which is 6,000 days' wages. Every day a person would get a denarius for a day's wage. So in order to even pay back 1 talent, that would take 16 years of daily labor. Because again, it's 6,000 days' wages. Well, this fellow did not owe the king 1 talent. He owed him 10,000 talents. How many days would it take? How long would it take to repay that debt? 160,000 years of daily labor. 160,000 years. So if he, let's say, started at the time of Christ, here we are 2,000 years later, he'd still have 158,000 years to continue to work to pay back that debt. The Lord used this drastic amount, this huge amount, to show it really is impossible. It was impossible for this man to pay back the king, even though he knelt down and said, I'll pay you back in full. And the king was going to order him to be put into debtor's prison with his wife and children and property, and be put into debtor's prison. But the man fell to his knees, begged the king. The king, who represents God, of course, is filled with compassion, and he forgives his debt in whole. The entire debt, the entire loan is forgiven. 10,000 talents, completely forgiven. Well, this servant gets up and walks out into the street and meets somebody who owes him, it says, a much smaller amount. The Greek says 100 denarii, which is 100 days' wages, something that could be paid off in about 3 months. And the fellow falls to the ground and says, give me time, I'll pay you back in full. But this servant who had just been forgiven this huge debt was unmerciful. And he strangled the guy and says, pay me back now, otherwise I'll throw you in prison. And he did. He threw this other man in prison until he paid back the debt, or his family would pay back the debt. Well, of course, it got back to the king. And the king called the original servant and said, you're a wicked servant. I forgave you your entire debt because you begged me. Should you not have had pity, compassion, mercy upon your fellow servant as I had pity on you? Then it says, in anger, the king handed him over to the torturers until he would pay back the entire debt, which of course would be an infinite debt, really. And then, of course, the most powerful statement, so will my heavenly Father do to each one of you unless each of you forgives your brother from your heart. So Lent, the reason why we have this passage during Lent is because Lent is about forgiveness. Lent is about forgiving others. It's about doing the works of mercy, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Almsgiving is the works of mercy, especially forgiving injuries is one of the spiritual works of mercy. So let's ask God for the grace to be loving and forgiving towards others, because we want God to be loving and forgiving towards us. We represent the first servant. We've been forgiven this eternal debt of separation from God because Jesus died on the cross for us. He paid the price for our salvation. He has forgiven us. When we go to confession, he has forgiven us this eternal debt, 160,000 years as in a sense. And yet, when we go out and meet somebody who has offended us in a very tiny way, we sometimes could be unforgiving. So let's realize be grateful as God has been so generous and so merciful towards us, that we're called to be generous and merciful towards others.